Does our faith cut the mustard? I'm glad somebody got it. Sasha was like, what? Does our faith cut the mustard? Reading from Matthew chapter 17, verses 14 to 21. At the foot of the mountain, a large crowd was waiting for them. A man came and knelt before Jesus and said, "Lord, have mercy on my son. He has seizures and suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him." Jesus said, "You faithless and corrupt people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." Then Jesus rebuked the demon in the boy, and it left him. From that moment, the boy was well. Afterward, the disciples asked Jesus privately, "Why couldn't we cast out that demon?" "You don't have enough faith," Jesus told them. "I tell you the truth, if you had faith, even as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it would move. Nothing would be impossible." So here's the scene. Jesus, James, John, and Peter have come down from a mountaintop where James, John, and Peter witnessed the transfiguration of Jesus. Jesus partially revealed his glory to James, John, and Peter. It says that his face shone as the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Moses and Elijah also came and joined in the party as well. It must have been an incredible moment to have witnessed that. From this wonderful experience on the mountaintop, Jesus, James, Peter, and John come down from the mountain to find this large crowd waiting for them. In the Gospel of Mark, he records the same story, and he tells us that the remaining disciples at the bottom of the mountain were arguing with the teachers of the law, and that there was a great commotion. Let's consider this father who brought his boy for healing. Put ourselves in the shoes of the father of this boy. How would you feel? How do you think you'd feel? He must have been desperate to find help for his boy. What one of us wouldn't do anything to help our child? What one of us wouldn't do anything to help our child? We read that he asked the disciples to help, but they could not. Do you think that he had asked others for help before? Do you think so? Of course he did. Perhaps that's why they were arguing with the teachers of the law at the foot of the mountain, the teachers of the laws and the disciples. Because they had been asked, the teachers of the law had been asked on previous occasions by the Father to help his son. You see, casting out demons was not something unique to Jesus and his disciples. You see, when the teachers of the law and the Pharisees previously, they accused Jesus of casting out demons, they said, "You do it by the power of the devil." Jesus' reply was, "Well, then by what power do you cast them out?" The point is this, is that the Father had asked everyone he knows to help his boy. The religious leaders couldn't do it. The disciples couldn't do it. So the man waits desperately for Jesus to come back down from the mountain. In Mark's account of the story, we read that his son has been like this ever since he was a boy. Can you imagine seeing your child go into a seizure and fall helplessly into water in danger of drowning? Or into fire, risk of life-threatening injury? Can you imagine that? I can. I actually can. I grew up with a sister who had epilepsy. My sister is 3 years older than me, and she had epilepsy. I'm not saying that she was demon-possessed. I'm saying she had epilepsy. And interestingly about the boy in this story, many people believed that he suffered from epilepsy. All the manifestations looked exactly like epileptic seizures. Commentator J. Wilkinson on this passage says, "I accept the view that he suffered from epilepsy. but do not find this incompatible with him being demon-possessed. What he's saying is this: let us not assume that every person with epilepsy is demon-possessed, okay? So he wants to make that clear. One does not necessitate the other. It just so happens that the boy in this story had both. And my sister, as far as I could tell, didn't have a demon. Although I wondered sometimes when we were fighting. Yes. So I can't imagine what this father was going through with this boy. It was clear that he loved his son, as there must have been great family care to watch over him. It does take a lot of family care to watch over a person like that. I remember watching out for my sister. Many times vacationing at the beach, we would always be aware that at any moment she could have a seizure and need to be pulled from the water. Now, my sister is one of the bravest people that I know. And she decided to not let her epilepsy stop her from doing things. So one day, she was water skiing. Yes, I told you she was brave. My sister with epilepsy is water skiing, and she had a seizure right in the middle of water skiing. I saw her fall, and so I shouted to Dad, who was driving the boat, that, "Oh, Veronica fell." And so when he brought the boat around, there she was, face down in the water in the middle of a seizure. Another time, we were riding our bikes together, and she was leading, and we were turning a corner, and she went into a seizure. I saw her ride straight into a cottage. Boom. The fortunate thing about having seizures is you don't remember the stuff that happens when you black out. Other times we would find my sister scratched all over her body as she had fallen into a rose bush. These are some of the incidents that were a part of our family growing up. And miraculously, my sister never suffered any long-time injuries from her many, many episodes. So when I became a Christian, and I read this story in the Bible, I totally identified with the father. Fortunately for us, when my sister was 30 years old, there was a new brain surgery procedure developed at the London Hospital of Ontario for people with epilepsy. And after isolating that area of the brain that caused seizures, they were able to remove it. She actually lived at the hospital for a couple of months where they monitored her brain activity, discovered where the seizures were being caused, and they took it out. They removed it. Since then, she's seizure-free. And she was able to get her driver's license. She's married. She has a son. And all of those hopes and dreams that a parent has for their child came true. Those hopes and dreams could be robbed by something like this. And the father who brought the boy to Jesus had never gave up on finding a solution for his son. He had heard the power of the disciples of Jesus. He heard that they had power to cast out demons and heal people. And then after they weren't able to heal his son, he waited for Jesus at the bottom of the mountain. His desperate hope placed in Jesus of Nazareth. And so he falls at the feet of Jesus, kneeling before him, humble and desperate for help. He says, "Lord, have mercy on my son. He has seizures and suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him." Jesus' response is a bit shocking. He says, "You faithless and corrupt people, how long will I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." Then Jesus rebuked the demon in the boy, and it left him. From that moment, the boy was well. Does anybody else here find the words of Jesus a bit harsh? Yeah. Jesus, the disciples couldn't heal my son. Will you heal him? Oh, you faithless and corrupt people. Sorry, I asked. Wow. Does this scene remind you of anything? Anybody? Does this scene remind you of anything? Jesus coming down from the mountain. And then Moses. Exactly. Sure it does. Moses, when Moses came down from the mountain after meeting God in Exodus chapter 32, Moses comes down and he finds the people engaged in idolatry. As a result, he punishes the people. Jesus comes down from the mountain and finds people without faith, just like Moses. And although Jesus calls it like it is, his response is one of mercy, not punishment. His response with mercy, he responds with mercy, just as the Father pleads and begs him to heal the boy. Yet, the accusation of Jesus, you faithless and corrupt people, his accusation would have rung in the ears of all who were there, especially who? Especially who? The disciples, exactly, especially those disciples. They know part of that scathing response of Jesus was aimed at them. How could they be faithless? In what way were the disciples corrupt? See that word corrupt, otherwise translated as perverted, twisted? It means that they were twisted in their thinking. They had a distorted spiritual attitude. This whole episode bothered the disciples. As I imagine, it was quite embarrassing for them, don't you think? Don't you think that would be really embarrassing? Of course it was. So once they were alone with Jesus, they brought it up. It says, afterward, the disciples asked Jesus privately, why couldn't we cast out that demon? You don't have enough faith, Jesus told them. I tell you the truth, if you had faith even as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it would move. Nothing would be impossible. And so here is the main point of the story. Faith is the necessary condition for overcoming life's obstacles. Faith is the necessary condition for overcoming life's obstacles. In teaching this lesson, Jesus again sounds very harsh. Notice that he says, you don't have enough faith. And then he goes on to say, if you only had faith as small as a mustard seed. Well, that's not very much, is it? Jesus is saying, you don't have any faith at all. It's really what he's saying. If you don't have that much faith, well, did I have half a grain of mustard seed? So maybe if I had half a grain more? No, that's not what Jesus is saying. He said, you don't have any faith at all. Remember his earlier accusation, you faithless and corrupt generation? He's reinforcing it. He's reinforcing this. All that they need is faith as small as a mustard seed. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like a whole lot of faith. Does it? No. Jesus is using the smallest thing known in his day to say two things. First, you don't have any faith. Second, you don't need a lot of faith to accomplish a lot. That's reassuring. Phew, something positive out of this. Consider that Jesus is telling his disciples they don't have faith. That's quite the statement. He not only accuses that generation of being without faith, but also the disciples. Didn't they have faith? The disciples thought they had faith. The disciples thought they had faith because they believed all the right things. They believed in God. They believed in Jesus. They believed Jesus was the Christ. They believed that they could cast out the demon. That wasn't a question. They believed they could do it. They certainly believed that Jesus could do it. But faith is not believing something to be true. It's intimate trust. Faith is not believing something to be true. It's intimate trust. This was the corrupt thinking they had fallen into. Their thinking had shifted from intimate trust to believing in the right things. Believing the right things does not please God. Intimate trust does. Do you think believing the right doctrines and belief systems are what God is looking for from us? Hmm? Do you think that's what God is looking for from us? I don't. I don't think that's what God's looking for from us at all. Now, that's not to say that we neglect what is taught about Jesus and God in the Bible. I mean, this is God revealed, and so I think we need to pay attention to those things. So I'm not saying we neglect that. But the Bible and the teaching of Jesus was not preserved and written so that we would believe the right thing, but that we would be moved to living a life of faith. That is why we have that book. That is why we have these writings. Believing the right thing and faith are two different things. James points this out in his book when he says in chapter 2, "You say you have faith, for you believe that there is one God? Good for you. Even the demons believe this, and they tremble in terror." Even to believe that there is a God, that's not faith, is what James is saying. I can believe all the right doctrines in the world, believe there is one God, believe Jesus can heal, but that is not faith. Consider one of the thieves on the cross beside Jesus when Jesus was crucified. Do you think that he believed all the right doctrines? Do you think he believed in the doctrine of the Trinity? Anybody? The what? Right. Do you think he believed, do you think he had a great understanding of Christology? Hey, thief on the cross, what's your Christology? What? No idea. How about the resurrection? No. How about the nature of Christ, fully God, fully man? What about the virgin birth? He had no clue about any of those things, but he looked to Jesus in hopes that he would be saved. He placed his trust in Jesus, to which Jesus responded, "Today you will be with me in paradise," in Luke chapter 23. Faith is intimate trust, not agreement with a truth statement. The power required to perform a healing for that boy required intimate trust. It is out of this relationship with God that power comes to move mountains. The disciples had shifted from a faith that was based in a trust of God to one of believing certain things about God to be true. This is evident in their arguing with the teachers of the law at the foot of the mountain when Jesus came down. The disciples knew that they could cast it out. They had done it before, but they had lost track of how. They were going through the motions, and they had neglected the disposition of their heart. They had moved from cultivating trust in God to doing things for God. They moved from cultivating trust in God to doing things for God. Has anybody here ever done that? I've never done that. It's a subtle but a very real difference. As a result, they had lost the power that comes from a life of faith. I like how R.T. France says it in the Tyndale commentary on the book of Matthew. On this passage, he says, "Faith for Jesus is not a matter of intellectual assent, but of a practical reliance on God." I like that. It's not a matter of intellectual assent, but practical reliance on a living God. We say we believe that Jesus can do this. This is intellectual assent. And Halford Lecoq in the Interpreter's Commentary says this: "In theory we believe, but in practice we often insist on something else." Do you believe Jesus can do this? Oh, yes. In theory we do. But often in our lives, we insist on taking care of things in life ourselves. Faith is not believing something crazy either. It's intimate trust in God. Faith is not believing something crazy. It's intimate trust in God. It is out of our trust relationship with God that comes power to move mountains. Keep in mind, the disciples had no doubt that they could do it, because they had done it before. Previously, in both Gospels, Jesus had sent the disciples out 2 by 2 and gave them power to cast out demons and heal the sick, they came back and said, Lord, the spirits obey us, and this is wonderful. So they had done it before, and then they lost track. They completely believed not only that it was possible, that they could do it. And we see this in their confusion about why they couldn't do it. To believe whether or not it could be done is intellectual assent, not faith. Consider in Mark's account of the story, he adds words to Jesus, and he says at the end of the story, but this kind only comes out by prayer and fasting. You see, the earlier manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark don't have this. It's not found in any of them. It's evident that it became a later addition. Now, that's not to say that it shouldn't be there. The early Christian community recognized that faith is cultivated in prayer and fasting. Which is exactly what Jesus is saying. That power comes from our faith. Power comes from our personal, intimate connection with God. Not about believing whether or not something is possible. To believe something is possible is the fruit, it's the evidence of our intimate trust. The intimate trust comes first. Believing the impossible without faith is just craziness. Right? Believing the impossible without faith is just craziness. Faith is not trying to convince ourselves something impossible might happen. It's knowing the one who can make anything happen. Faith is not trying to convince ourselves something impossible might happen. It's knowing the one who can make anything happen. That's what true faith is. God's not asking us to believe crazy things. He's looking for intimate trust. I like how D.A. Carson says it in the Expositor's Commentary. He says, Jesus tells his disciples that what they need is not giant faith. Tiny faith will do. What they need is not giant faith, but true faith. Faith that out of a deep personal trust expects God to work. Out of deep personal trust expects God to work. I love that. That's just great. Our focus should not be on the challenge at hand, but on the one who can overcome all challenges, Jesus Christ. God's not looking for a lot of faith, just a little. The tiniest bit of faith. That can make all the difference in the world. Imagine that mustard seed of faith. A mustard seed is one of the smallest conceivable things at that time. And the disciples didn't even have that much faith. Their faith didn't cut the mustard. Thank you. I couldn't wait to say that. Their faith didn't cut the mustard. If they had just that little teeny tiny bit of faith, they could move mountains. Moving mountains, that's proverbial for overcoming great difficulties. Jesus isn't saying you can literally move a mountain. It's proverbial. It means that we can overcome the great difficulties in life. And it doesn't mean that we get whatever the whims of our heart's desires either. It means what Jesus is saying, there are infinite resources available for those who exercise even the smallest amount of faith. And finally, we turn our attention back to the father of the boy, who in the account of Mark says this. He says, I believe. Help my unbelief. I love that. I love that. This man recognizes his lack of faith, and he appeals to mercy to make up for the lack thereof. He begs Jesus, help me in spite of my lack of faith. Compare this to the disciples who had no idea that they lacked faith. They thought they had faith. On one hand, we have this pure, honest confession of a man desperate to help his son. He doesn't put on any pretense of faith, no religious air, no attempt to show on the outside what he knows to be true of himself on the inside. It is this honesty that moves Jesus to have mercy. The disciples were clueless of their true state, their lack of faith. Not only here, but this whole section in Matthew, the disciples' failures are a recurring theme. Read through that section, the section around chapter 14. The failure of the disciples is a recurring theme there. What had happened to them? Why? What's Matthew saying there? Saying the disciples needed a new understanding of what God wants from us, as opposed to what their upbringing taught them God wanted of them. They had grown up in a culture that taught that you do the right things to please God. You behave a certain way, you obey the religious laws, you believe the right doctrines. And so Jesus had to reprogram them, teach them that God is not looking for any of that. God is looking for a heart that trusts him, because it is impossible to please God without faith. Hebrews 11:6. So he's looking for a faith that does cut the mustard.